And that, my friends, is a fine introduction to Virginia Military Institute. I hope those clips from one of the Friday dress parades in 2018 got you excited about our topic today. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5, and today we are talking about Virginia Military Institute and its role in the American Civil War. Now, the Battle of Newmarket, which was fought on May 15, 1864, took place several decades into Virginia Military Institute's history, but it became a defining moment, part of the school's legacy, part of their tradition, and part of their memory in a very significant way. Today we're going to talk about the foundations of Virginia Military Institute, what the cadets did during the Civil War, and how they were called out to join the Confederate Army prior to that all-important battle. In some of my previous videos, I have referred to the idea of citizen soldier. We've talked about militias. That is a foundational point in understanding VMI's beginnings. Virginia Military Institute was founded in 1839 with a dual purpose. First of all, it was going to help guard the arsenal that was located in Lexington, Virginia. This was a stockpile of weapons that would be available for militia, citizen soldiers, in time of crisis. Secondly, the folks who would be guarding those weapons, keeping an eye on them, could be young men, cadets, that would be being trained in both academic studies and military studies. The school grew and prospered between 1839 and the beginning of the Civil War. By the spring of 1864, just weeks prior to the Battle of Newmarket, there were about 280 cadets at Virginia Military Institute when their superintendent wrote to General Breckinridge offering the cadets service as reinforcements for his small army that was coming together. The superintendent said that about 250 would be available for active duty. We know that about 257 actually were on the field at Newmarket. In 1864, the superintendent of Virginia Military Institute was Francis H. Smith, and he would serve as the superintendent of VMI for about 50 years. He played a very important role in the history of the Institute and in the lives of many of the cadets who attended there. That didn't mean that the cadets really liked him all the time. He was the guy who enforced the rules, who helped hand out punishments if necessary, who wrote to parents and might say what had been going on at the school in a cadet's life. The cadets called Francis Smith Old Specs. If you're looking at documents, primary sources written by cadets during the Civil War period, you'll often see references to Old Specs this, Old Specs that. That's a reference to Superintendent Smith. And they called him that because he wore glasses, so they're making fun of these spectacles that he wore. Now, the commandant of cadets in 1864 was a man named Scott Shipp. He plays a vital role in Virginia Military Institute history as well. And in the Battle of Newmarket, he plays a key part. He will be in charge of the Corps of Cadets as they make the march to Newmarket and during the battle. He's the one who writes the official report that goes into the official records of the war, and he is in charge of these approximately 250 cadets that will march to join Breckinridge's army. Superintendent Smith stayed at the Institute with the other cadets who stayed behind. Shipp took the Corps of Cadets to join Breckinridge. Alright, let's talk about the cadets. We'll talk about them in generalized terms, but who were these young men that would play a crucial role in filling a gap in Breckinridge's line on May 15, 1864? Well, the first thing you need to know is a little bit about their age. The cadets at Virginia Military Institute that spring ranged from ages 15 into their mid-20s. That's a big age gap. There's a lot of myth. There's a big idea that the cadets who fight at Newmarket were all very young boys who had no military experience. That's not really true. I'm not saying that to take anything away from what the cadets did at Newmarket. It was very impressive. It was very important. We should take nothing away from their courage and sense of duty that they exhibited there at Newmarket. But they were not all 15, like as sometimes you'll hear in stories or movie depictions or things like that. A few of the cadets who fight at Newmarket had been on Civil War battlefields before. Not the majority, but a few of them had. What tended to happen was you had these very young boys, young men, teenagers, who would show up in Confederate military units. Well, sooner or later somebody would figure out they were under 18, or there was some reason that they shouldn't be with that regiment. And sometimes they would get packed off to a military school, like Virginia Military Institute. Also, you have quite a few cadets there who have been sent to the Institute by their families who are attempting to keep their sons out of the war. It's not necessarily from a lack of patriotism. Oftentimes you find that some of the boys there are maybe only children or youngest sons, and the families have already experienced war's casualties with some of the older sons, so they're trying to keep their youngsters or their young men safe. When a young man arrived at VMI, he would be called a rat. Right, a rat. They're still called rats to this day. And that basically means that you are going to be treated in an interesting manner by upperclassmen. And it has changed throughout the historical decades of what that treatment might be. During the Civil War, there was a lot of practical joking. In many ways, it was harmless, but it definitely may have been termed bullying by modern standards. A lot of teasing, sometimes some mental games, things like that would be played upon these rats, and the rats would be subject to military training. It would almost be like, we would think of it as an encampment, if we could borrow a modern military term. So they would spend the summer months going through extensive drill, learning how to march, learning all these different military things that would help them become a fully integrated cadet. Now, certainly some cadets were interested in the academic portion that was offered at Virginia Military Institute, and it was a fine course of education in 1864, or, the mid-19th century. They were studying mathematics, sciences, history, writing, philosophies, military studies, of course. It was a solid education, along with the military training that they were receiving. Some of the cadets really wanted to excel academically and put in the time and effort. However, if you think about teenage boys or young men in their early 20s, not all of them are interested in being bookworms. So when we look at cadets' correspondence from this era, there is a lot of complaining about academics, about tests. A lot of fear comes through when it's time for examinations. Another thing that's noticeable in cadets' letters and writings from this period in Civil War history and Institute history is frustration. There's a lot of frustration among these young men that they are not involved in the war, in the conflict that's happening. They know that the Confederate armies need men, and they're wondering why they are at school and not serving in the Confederate Army. So you have a lot of requests going home to mother and father in the early months of 1864 saying things like, "I am a man," or "I'm almost a man. Why do I have to stay at school? I want to be there fighting." A lot of their families were more than happy to know that they would stay at school. That didn't keep some cadets from hatching elaborate plots to get lots of demerits, get enough demerits that they could get kicked out of school so that they could go join the army. So there was a lot of conflict going on at the Institute, quiet conflict, about we have to stay at school and there's a war going on and we're training to be soldiers and we really want to be soldiers. There was this idea that they could not wait. They thought they could not wait to be soldiers. They could not wait to get to a battlefield. Many of them thought that they would go individually, either by getting out of school or running away or coming of age and going to join the army. Probably most of them did not think that they would actually go as a student body to a battlefield. I want to take a couple moments now and show you some photographs of cadets that were at Virginia Military Institute during this period of the Civil War, and they would be called the Newmarket Cadets. It doesn't mean they went to school at Newmarket, it means that they were cadets from Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia, who fought at Newmarket, hence we call them Newmarket Cadets. So here are some photographs of those young men. Now you may have noticed I keep talking about guys, boys, young men. All of the cadets at Virginia Military Institute in the 19th century were male, and no girls allowed. So, with that being said, there's one thing that I want to point out quickly so that there is no confusion. There is one cadet who has a very interesting name. Actually, there's a few cadets who fight at Newmarket that have interesting names, but this one is one that you'll probably hear if you visit the battlefield or read a book or see a documentary about the cadets and the battle. His name, his full and given name, was Jacqueline Beverly Stannard. And a lot of people get confused when they first hear that name, because to our modern ear, Jacqueline and Beverly sound like girls' names. Well, he was a guy. His comrades called him Jack. He was a very manly fellow. He liked to go fishing, ice skating, torture groundhogs, and write letters to Mother saying how hungry he was and how he needed more money. So, don't be confused. It's all guys in the Corps of Cadets that will show up at Newmarket in 1864. Last year, while doing research for my new book, Call Out the Cadets, I had the privilege to visit Virginia Military Institute and do some research in their archives. It was a wonderful experience. While there, I had the opportunity to shoot a couple of video clips on location. So I'd like to go ahead and share those with you now. These were among my first attempts at doing video clips, and there's about 8 takes before we got the ones that you see. So you could count it as those were the icebreaker moments of the idea of doing videos like this. Virginia Military Institute was established in 1839 for the purpose of training and preparing citizen soldiers. During the American Civil War, cadets from Virginia Military Institute played a larger role than just at the Battle of Newmarket. Newmarket was not the first time that some of Virginia Military Institute cadets had served with the Confederate Army. For example, in 1861, Thomas J. Jackson, a former professor at VMI, took the senior class of cadets with him, where they became drill instructors for the new recruits for the Confederate Army. Many of Virginia Military Institute's professors and alumni and cadets served with Confederate forces during the American Civil War. Perhaps one of the most famous was Thomas J. Jackson. Before the war, he was a professor and taught natural philosophy at the Institute. He goes down in history as being one of probably the worst professors and teachers, maybe ever, but definitely in the history of the Institute. However, Jackson was very successful on the battlefield and gained fame and a solid reputation that continued to build the reputation of Virginia Military Institute. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, when he was launching a famous flank attack against one of the Union Corps, he said to another of his generals, who was also from VMI, that the Institute will be heard from today. The cadets who fought at Newmarket were very aware of General Jackson's reputation and that he had been a professor at VMI. Most did not know him personally and had not sat in his classroom. However, they knew about him and were very proud of him. Jackson died in 1863. He was buried in Lexington, and the following year, May 10, 1864, the cadets took part in a special ceremony at Jackson's graveside.
The evening of that day, they received the orders to march to join General John C. Breckinridge's army.
In addition to the history of Stonewall Jackson and those incidents mentioned in those on location videos, I did want to note that May 1864 was not the first time the Corps of Cadets had been called out to assist or shadow, if you will, a Confederate army. In 1862, some of the cadets will join Stonewall Jackson's army in the Valley Campaign in the spring of 1862. They will actually be present at the Battle of McDowell, which is fought May 8th, 1862. However, the cadets take no active part in that conflict. They guard some baggage wagons at a distance from the battlefield and then later help to bury the dead. Also, in the late fall and winter of 1863, the cadets go out on a long march. They're marching over mountainous terrain in the area around Lexington and beyond, and they're trying to help chase down or defend against a Union cavalry that was doing some raiding in that area. So the cadets that would go to Newmarket many of them had experienced that winter campaign. It gave them a boost of confidence, another reason to write to mother and father and say, I'm ready to be a soldier. But there was a feeling of expectation, a readiness in the barracks at Virginia Military Institute. May 10th passed with ceremony. May 10th marked the first anniversary since Stonewall Jackson had died, and since he had been a professor at VMI, some of the cadets had gone to his graveside and participated in a special ceremony. Then they returned to the Institute, they had evening parade, they went off to their barracks after their meal, and they thought they were settling in for a quiet night. But it was on May 10th, 1864 that the message arrived from John Breckinridge. He needed the cadets, the approximately 250 that Superintendent Smith had said would be available. He needed them to join him at Stanton, Virginia, which was miles north. And that night, they called the cadets from the barracks, read the marching orders, and told them the next day they would be leaving to join Breckinridge's army. To the cadets, it was an electrifying moment. They would remember waiting solemnly while the orders were read, and then, once it was finished and they were dismissed, they started cheering wildly. Those cheers were echoing in the walls of the Institute. Then they went to get ready. They didn't get much rest that night. The following day, May 11th, they set out on their march to Stanton. They would be joining Breckinridge's gathering army, and they would arrive 2 days later, making a very fast march to join this gathering Confederate army, and then they would continue on northward with Breckinridge to Newmarket. We're going to talk about the details of the Cadets' March in a later video. We'll actually spend one video talking about how the armies got to Newmarket, because the Confederates take a very interesting route, the Cadets have a very fast march, and Sigel and his men take their time moving in the valley, and how the armies moved, where they came from, plays a big part in how the troops line up on the battlefield at Newmarket, and what happens as the day unfolds. Well, we spent today talking about the Virginia Military Institute and its cadets in the Civil War era. I hope you've enjoyed this video. The next video we're actually going to release on May 15th, which is the battle anniversary. And since this is 2019, it'll be 155 years since the battle. We'll take a little bit of a break from the campaign study and discussion that we've been doing in these videos and do more of a memorial piece, a video that shares primary sources about the battle, and I think you'll find it very interesting and reflective, appropriate for the day. So I hope you'll join us next week, and that will be all for today. Thank you so much and have an inspired week. Bye-bye.